Hello, dear viewers, dear listeners. Welcome to A Certain Amount of Madness. I'm your host, Mamka Anyona. So on today's show, we are going to be talking about the spectacle that comes about once every 4 years and has the whole world holding its breath, waiting for the outcome, and that is the US election. Now, the reason why the US election is of so much interest to so many countries in the world is obvious. The outcomes have massive implications for people across the world. However, in Africa, that seems not to be the case because there seems to be a bipartisan consensus about how the US should approach Africa. Let me quote Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who said that since the Clinton administration, the US approach to Africa has followed a similar formula involving signature development programs, aspirational talk around democracy and human rights, and ever-expanding security partnerships, but not much more. Let's look at this from a historical perspective. So in the last 20 years, we've had 4 American presidents. George Bush gave us PEPFAR. PEPFAR was this incredible initiative, humanitarian initiative to deal with HIV/AIDS, which was decimating our continent. Now, I am grateful to PEPFAR because I have extended family who are alive today because of PEPFAR. But PEPFAR's legacy is not without blemish. For example, the parallel system that PEPFAR created really weakened our public healthcare systems. And because of its neoliberal model, it completely decimated our pharmaceutical industry on the continent. And let's not forget that the reason why Bush was using PEPFAR was to whitewash what he was doing in the Middle East. Then it was followed by Barack Obama. When Barack Obama won, a cheer erupted across the entire continent because we thought, we have a son of the soil in the White House, and for the first time, they're going to take us seriously. For the first time, they're going to think about us.
Lakeside born, let's not forget.
But what happened? We were ignored possibly more than ever. And in fact, Obama's greatest legacy was the US-led NATO invasion of Libya in 2011. And he took what was one of the most prosperous, most stable countries on this continent and has now turned it into a cesspool of militias, human trafficking, modern-day slavery, and affecting the entire Sahel region. Basically, Africa is now suffering the half of all deaths that come from terrorism because of what happened in Libya. Mm. Then that was followed by Donald Trump. And who can forget his infamous opinion about the shithole countries of Africa? His America First approach completely ignored Africa. And during that time, there was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, countries such as China and Russia gained a stronger foothold on the continent. Who's to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing? Definitely not me. And then that was followed by Joe Biden. And the main thing Joe Biden had to do was to claw back the gains that America had had as an empire before Trump's time. But what has Biden's legacy been in Africa? It has been the militarization of America's fallen relations with Africa. In fact, before Niger kicked out the American army in 2023, it had one of the most significant footprints of American army bases in the world. Now, as we look at Kamala versus Trump, we have to ask ourselves, is there going to be any difference in Africa's relations with the US depending on who comes to power? And if there will be, or if there won't be, what should the African approach be to relating with the US? In this discussion, I am joined by David Adler, the General Coordinator of the Progressive International, and Kiritu Chege, who is a member of the Young Communist League in Kenya. And I will invite them to introduce themselves before they respond to, before we start the discussion. And I will start with David, who's joining us from DC. And I will put to him a question using Mwalimu Julius Nyerere's famous words. The United States is a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have 2 of them. So David, tell us, is this your opinion of the American democratic space?
Hi, Mamka. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the generous introduction. My name is David Adler, and I'm the general coordinator of this great coalition of parties and unions and movements across the world, many on the African continent. That goes by the name of the Progressive International, where we think a lot about these questions of U.S. influence, and particularly of the questions of international order that you mentioned in the outset of the program, and how it was constructed to prevent, to choke off, to surveil, and to undermine developmental outcomes across the world. And so when we look at these elections, of course, I think it's worth lamenting at the outset the outsized influence that these elections are going to have across the world. There should be no podcast that should have to be focused on an election between two presidential candidates in a country that is literally thousands of kilometers away from the African continent. But here we are, with 29 U.S. military bases scattered across the continent, forced to discuss not just these questions of military action or inaction, but like you mentioned before, the kind of close complicity and cooperation of the U.S. American government with a range of so-called philanthropic initiatives that aim to extend tentacles of our influence, oftentimes malign influence throughout the region. And of course, Kenya is a very specific country case that we can talk about a bit more, where I think that it might prove your point that despite the fact that we have electoral contests that will have major impacts on a range of domestic outcomes, we think of reproductive rights as being a critical issue on which there are some substantial differences between parties. That's not to say that each of those parties are equally effective at mobilizing their political power to achieve substantial outcomes with respect to those priorities, right? We know that, for example, in the case of Barack Obama, despite being a big advocate of abortion rights, for example, was not able to enshrine into law, despite having an alignment of power between Congress, Senate, and the presidency, any such protection that could prevent the backlash that would come in the wake of that presidency when Donald Trump came to power in 2016. But I think it's worth making a distinction between these domestic outcomes and international policy, or foreign policy, as we call it in the United States, which has a kind of mind of its own. The security apparatus in this country is huge. Many of the so-called three-letter agencies will be well known to your audience: CIA, the FBI, NSA, NSC, DOD, etc. I mean, there is a huge sort of sector of the government that is rather clandestine. It's not easy to view, but it's much less easy to influence. So I think we'll run through some of these potential implications for Africa. I think that there are many. I think that speaking from a sort of global Southern perspective, this election carries tremendous importance across a range of issues. Such as, kind of basic respect for democratic will, and that's not something that the Republican Party in particular has a good record on. But I think that to take Nira's point very seriously, while Republicans and Democrats may differ in their tactics of intervention, for example, Republicans have very little shame in mobilizing bombs and bullets. Democrats typically prefer the use of economic weapons like sanctions. Both have designs for Africa under the banner of this new Cold War. Both are extremely committed to excising what they perceive to be a malignant presence of China on the continent, certainly of Russia on the continent. And I think that both parties have very little assess very little value in African life generally. Of course, we saw that in a place like Libya, where NATO in its entirety, was mobilized to topple this regime, and we all know the disastrous consequences there. But the same could be said of these kind of clandestine operations in a place like Niger. I think that the U.S. is in a place now, a highly geopolitical, geostrategic mindset. And with that, frequently, as we saw in the last Cold War context, comes a high tolerance for collateral damage, for its diverse designs for global domination and primacy. So I think that when it comes to Africa, there are subtle differences and important differences. Mm-hmm. When I say subtle differences coming from the United States, that can still impact millions, if not hundreds of millions of lives. Mm-hmm. But I think that in either case, both are determined principally to reclaim a pride of place as the major great power partner on the continent. And I think that in that sense, there is something extravagant about overstating the differences between Democrats and Republicans in this election, because in both instances, the goodness and the greatness of the USA must win out.
Thank you so much, David. That was a great summary of what we can expect, which answers the question. And the answer, I suppose, is Nyerere is correct. That the aims of the United States are going to be pretty much similar across the different parties, whatever the outcome to Africa. But let me come to you, Kiritu. I would like you to talk a little bit more about what David touched on vis-a-vis the presence of other superpowers within the continent. Give us a little bit of a background about the growth of China's influence in Africa, the growth of Russia's influence in Africa, and what you expect to come with the next administration, regardless of who wins. And if you think there's going to be any difference.
My name is Kiritu Chege. I am a member of the Communist Party of Kenya. I work under the party, of course, which is the vanguard of the working class and the peasantry. You talked about agriculture and industry, of course, hammer and sickle, the two bases of productivity that are fundamental to any operational or working country. So, of course, as the Communist Party of Kenya, we are looking to be the vanguard of the masses to ensure that they respect the rights of the proletariat in the agricultural industry and the actual industry, are actually safeguarded. I will say, and this is to answer your question, even as you spoke of the withdrawal of Trump and how it created a vacuum on the African continent, I think the extent to which the United States underestimated just how valuable Africa was even predates Trump. I will say that. Of course, Obama demonstrated just how little they give a fuck about. Sorry, I swore. I don't give a fuck. Didn't like Africa with Libya. But I'll use a Kenyan perspective here and talk about how the seeds of countries like China and Russia, I mean, China specifically, as I know, were in the Kibaki administration, which was during 2003 or peaking actually during the Obama years after 2007, after the post-election violence. So I think to a certain extent, it didn't even click until when Antony Blinken, I saw a tweet on his or on Twitter. We're supposed to call it X, but no. I saw a tweet where he said the future is Africa. And of course, any normal, rational person would be like, oh, that's a nice thing to say. But when you think about the fact that this is the Secretary of State for the United States of America saying the future is Africa under the presidency of Joe Biden, who has organized genocide against Palestinians, you start to think, oh, what the hell do they want to do? I think people really underestimate how much of the global economy is built on Africa. I think there are a lot of analyses that we can make, a lot of stats and statistics that we can pull out. But one of the things that often helps clarify this is to help people really understand that to a certain extent, the kind of countries that are in the middle, between hegemony and the periphery, between the core and the periphery of the American hegemonic order, they are ones that are able to act as vassals for the United States. Now, that applies to a lot of Asian countries. Japan, Okinawa, the military base is there. You'll always see wherever there is a military base, there's a vassal. The extent to which that military base is big will tell you just how important it is for that country to remain as a vassal state. Applies to Japan, applies to a lot of these rising tigers that you were told of during the early 2000s. So of course you saw that thing of like, oh, so the most important thing for the United States should be Asia. And you didn't see as much investment into Africa. This carries through even towards like the Clinton, Bush years, even before Obama. And you saw during when the United States was carrying out its war on terror, that's where the Kibaki administration started to pick up. And of course, that's where China started to get in. But of course, there was a lot of disinterest coming into the Trump years. And that's where you see 2017, Ruto takes over. And now we have one of the most right-wing policies on the African continent. So much so that right now with Joe Biden, Kenya is now the fourth major non-NATO ally. There are only three more on the African continent: Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. Now Kenya has joined the list, which shows you the extent to which a lot of these issues are playing out on the African continent are often ignored until you start paying attention. And it's not just out of like the fact that, Obama was half Kenyan, and so Biden decided to throw a bone to Kenya. No, it's really about, one, strategic importance of Kenya. Right now, Kenya is being organized to invade, to help cover up or disguise America's intervention into Haiti. There is also Yemen, and how Kenya, if it were to occupy Somalia, would be very instrumental in breaking the Yemeni blockade so that the United States can better access Israel or help its vassal, which is Israel. By the way, I don't like the conspiracy that Israel controls the United States. That's bullshit. America controls Israel. Let's be clear. But regardless, that there's a very strategic role that Kenya has. It's literally between the two sources of the Nile River. And so with what's happening with Ethiopia and Egypt being told, oh, there's nothing you're doing with Palestine, there is no response you're having. What's Egypt's decision? To go and help Somalia fight Ethiopia, which of course, granted, Somalia has a lot of, legitimate grievances. It's like the Ukraine of Africa, has a lot of legitimate grievances towards Ethiopia because of land and blah, blah, blah. Kenya also has problems there, of course, because of the whole thing of within Kenya. But regardless, Egypt's main point isn't to help Somalia. It's to destroy the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which threatens one of the branches of the Nile River. Kenya is on the other half, which is now around, I don't like the name Lake Victoria, I like Namdolwe because, of course, Lakeside. Though, of course, Obama wouldn't get it. He calls himself a son of the soil, but he isn't. We reject Obama. We reject Obama in Kenya. But we stand on the other side. So, of course, it's important to have all of these kind of power plays happen on the African continent, but it's always to distract towards the goals which are being achieved by the United States in Palestine, in Sudan, in Somalia, and elsewhere. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot to discuss there.
That is excellent, Kiritu. And this brings me very smoothly into the next question, because I want to stay with the question of America's military presence in Africa, but I want to pivot just slightly away from it to its intentions. So there's now a global arms race for clean energy. China is trying to get its hands on as many minerals as possible. The US and Europe are a bit behind the curve on that one. But we all know that Africa holds a lot of those minerals,
A lot.
the DRC specifically. And it would be disingenuous of us not to relate America's military presence on the continent, and especially Biden's upcoming trip to Angola for the, what do you call it, what's the name of that road that they're creating?
The Luanda
corridor.
There is a corridor from
Yeah.
Angola to better access Congo, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll edit this part out. So back to the arms race for clean energy. And so on this, I want to come to David. Kamala Harris and Trump have very different perceptions of the climate change crisis that we are facing. And that means that they're going to have very divergent positions on policy, both domestic and international. What sort of impact do you think this will have on countries that are carrying the minerals that are necessary to attend to this arms race? For example, do you expect that there's going to be any sort of change in approach towards DRC?
Absolutely not. No, I don't think that any differences in their views about climate change will impact this policy. And I think that the U.S. security state has been extremely clear about identifying minerals and metals and petroleum. I mean, any of these natural resources as being priorities for our geostrategic approach to global affairs. So no, I don't think that there's any difference, and I think it would be reasonable to expect that in the next 4 years we move into a phase of pretty sort of straight proxy conflict between China and the United States, instigated by the United States, over access and control over those resources. So I don't think that, as much as Donald Trump, I guess, vaguely, sometimes pathetically, flaccidly denies some of the sort of most visible and flagrant and scary consequences of a heating planet, I don't think that that's going to change at all the strategic approach when it comes to securing U.S. control over these natural resources. I just don't think that that's an area where presidents really matter so much. I mean, this is where that close-knit relationship between high industrial and finance capital with the United States government becomes paramount, and their priorities and their profits are really kind of epicentral to the formation of U.S. American foreign policy. And we see that play out in other regions across the world. You see Laura Richardson, who's the famous head of the U.S. Southern Command, which is based in Latin America, give very frank speeches about the need to basically tap into strategic reserves of lithium in places like Bolivia and Argentina, and also to prevent access of our geopolitical adversaries to those same resources. And it's not just in security apparatus. I mean, there's also legislation, bipartisan legislation about confronting the China threat or the Russia threat in these regions by developing a more ambitious approach to sort of resource security. And I think that the violence will likely intensify around these areas and hotspots that are designated to be strategic, which now I think should be the scariest word to any African ear. When the U.S. talks about something being strategic, it usually means that they're willing to deploy any amount of force to secure control over that territory or that resource or that political system.
All right. Let's stay with that a little longer. So we understand that the reason why the U.S. has such an strategic interest in the Middle East was because of oil, which was one of the most crucial resources in the 20th century for development. And now we are moving towards renewable energy, and that makes Africa strategically important. So, David, do you think that there's going to be any, I think you may have said this already, but do you think there would be any sort of, what should we be expecting regardless of the administration in terms of America's military presence on the continent? And what sort of should we be expecting vis-a-vis the conflicts across the continent? And on this, I'd like you to also reflect a little bit on the coups in West Africa and the American response to those coups, and how you think the approach will shift with an Africa that is growing much more restless with its relationship with the United States.
I don't think that the U.S. will go gently into a new security arrangement in the Sahel or anywhere else, really, in which we are excluded from strategic decision making. And And I do think that there are going to be different approaches that come from Democrats and Republicans. I think that Democrats like to think in terms of grand strategy. I think that they're going to be a much more ambitious attempt, if not at rapprochement, it's something kind of like a new strategic design for Africa. This is real chessboard thinking. I mean, truly colonial approach to these regimes. But I think that, they're not stupid. There's a certain reckoning with the fact that these governments in West Africa in particular are seeking new, shall we say, less colonial arrangements, more sovereign arrangements, and certainly have the mandate to do so. And this is, of course, not touching on the question of the other major colonial presence in the region, which is France, who also, I think, is not going gently into the post-colonial configuration. I think Republicans and this set of Trumpist Republicans tend to be much more in sort of targeted in their interventions. So I think that there's going to be less of a grand strategic approach and more of a, these are our friends, these are our enemies, and if you're designated as our enemy, then anything, all bets are off, and whatever means must be deployed to kind of reclaim and secure our sort of strategic position in the continent. I think it will be deployed. It's just very difficult to assess this stuff now. I think again, to go back to our original point, I don't want to overstate the difference between these two parties, and I think that there's a tremendous amount of continuity between Democrats and Republicans historically on issues of foreign policy. In between Trump and Biden, there was a tremendous amount of continuity. So I think the question is the one that you posed, Mamka, which is what is Africa's plan for itself? I mean, I think that these things are happening now in Africa that we haven't seen in a long time. And I think that the endogenous political economic dynamics in Africa will either provoke a reaction from the United States, which is very likely, or facilitate, some kind of new arrangement. And I think again, Kenya, I think, is a really good example of this. It was not. You couldn't have telegraphed necessarily the position that Ruto would have occupied vis-a-vis the United States, just how far he would have gone towards this kind of imperial puppetry. And I think that speaks a bit to the Democrats' ability to maneuver more effectively and find tools of, if not persuasion, then at least purchasing these people towards their geopolitical ends. I don't know, or using the IMF, right? And using other instruments to basically design coercive measures that can guide our strategic influence. I don't know how much Republicans are going to be deft and elegant about those priorities, but they definitely share the same set of strategic priorities.
Yes. So I want to come to Kiritu because we need to be talking about the African response to the United States. But before I do, let me just pose one other question to David. Now, we have talked about the stick vis-a-vis the relationship between the US and Africa, but we haven't talked about the carrot. Do you think that the United States could extend a carrot, as in trade policy changes that favor Africa, some sort of development packages that go beyond what we have seen so far? Is there a possibility that there may be something in it for the few privileged in Africa?
I don't. The U.S. has become less and less capable of cultivating carrots that are attractive to its partners, and more effective at sharpening its sticks. So I'm sure there'll be a new offer of something like development financing for Africa, which will come with horrendous conditionalities that will, punish the people that sit under the governments who sign on to those financing agreements. That's kind of our specialty these days, and Democrats are very good at that. I think the old adage that, when the Chinese come, they build a hospital. When the British come and the US come, they give us a lecture, I think holds true. And I wouldn't understate the close proximity of the US government with these large philanthropies like the Gates Foundation. that are trotted out to basically do the sort of philanthropic side. Why? Because there's basically no appetite, no bipartisan appetite to do development assistance from the United States. It's not for all the conversations now. There's a very influential piece circulating in Foreign Affairs by Brian Deese about a new kind of global Marshall Plan around green energy. But the terms and conditions of that Marshall Plan, frankly, like the initial Marshall Plan, which was about entrenching U.S. corporate power in kind of post-war Europe, I think will be very similar. This is not about doing good for the people of Africa. This is about repositioning the United States in an increasingly multipolar context to sustain its primacy in a continent that it took for granted for way too long.
Thank you, David. So, Kiritu, let's come to you and tell us what is Africa doing about the United States' presence on the continent? I mean, for very many years, Africa has been really passive. In the post-colonial era, there was a great sense of jubilation that the countries were now free, and there was a lot that we were going to do. There was a strong spirit of Pan-Africanism, and the continent was progressing at a rate that was decimated in the 80s during the era of the debt crisis and the structural adjustment programs. And it looks like we have just never recovered. So tell me a little bit about Africa's political response.
I'm taking notes of everything that you and David are saying, and then I'm like, I have to talk about all of this. Then the question takes me to a whole other thing. Because, let me first bring up, I don't necessarily think that Africa has been passive in the post-colonial period. Actually, I do think the warning signs for what the post-colonial period would look like were already being raised before the colonizers left. I'd have to delve into like the post-colonial arrangement that were made in other countries. I feel like, for example, Tanzania had a better one than Kenya. Viva Julius Nyerere. But for Kenya, the British knew very well when they were leaving the economy in safe hands. They left it in the hands of Jomo Kenyatta. And a lot of prominent figures, especially within the Kenya Landed Freedom Army, who actually led the war for independence against the British. There were documents that were issued talking about how the kind of orders that the likes of Kenyatta wanted to bring in were actually bad. But you see, I think people also underestimate how important it was for us to just have flag independence. Colonialism itself was all encompassing. There was no place for Africans within their own system. It was the culmination of centuries upon centuries of encroachment by the colonizers, ever since the age of discovery with Portugal and Spain going into the New World, blah, blah, blah. Literally, Fort Jesus was built by the Portuguese during the 1500s. All of this was chipping away and eroding art. So just as colonization wasn't a single thing, so too I think decolonization would just be a single thing. We got shitty as leaders onto the presidency, like Jomo Kenyatta, followed by Daniel Arap Moi. But as much as I'd like to be like, these people are the worst, blah 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 blah, it was an extremely, and I mean an extremely small step, but also showed the lengths to which the colonizers couldn't sustain their policies having their faces on it. That in itself is a significant achievement because it showed the unsustainability of colonialism to begin with. So even then, the death bell for the neo-colonial world has already been signed. Regardless of whether it's Kenyatta or Moi, people are now thinking less about the faces and more about the system itself. So think about, for example, when you're asking David about the carrot and the sticks, I thought about the latest carrot that has been offered in Kenya, Finance Bill 2024. It's very much emblematic of the type of carrots that the United States is willing to give Kenya. Bigger kickbacks for Ruto and his cronies and more burdens on the Kenyan masses. But the biggest problem isn't that the United States doesn't like the deal or that the Kenyan political class doesn't like the deal. It's that more and more people are getting angrier about the kind of carrots that are being offered to Kenya. And I think it's precisely because the type of systems that are offered, the type of carrots themselves are offered on an ideological basis of neoliberalism. That in itself cannot change because the United States economy right now was rearranged on the Reagan era of all of these things of the Washington Consensus, blah, blah, blah. But regardless, you find that is in terms of neoliberalism differing from other free market capitalist policies that the West has championed before during the era of FDR or in those previous eras, blah, blah, blah. They feel like small distinctions without any meaningful difference. So you find the more the world is subjugated under Western hegemony, with the latest iteration of it being, of course, the Americans, because they weren't the first. Literally, the first were like the Portuguese and the Spanish, blah, blah, blah. But regardless, there is now a restlessness of we want substantially better arrangements. And I think that's where France, for example, I think that's where the whole thing of France is coming in, because I think one of the first steps I've noticed like that's really happening is that more and more Africa is being severed, having its ties severed from Europe to the benefit of USA. So Kenya is now less under British influence than it was in 1960 and more under direct American control. The same, I think, if there is going to be any response in the Sahel, I think the United States was aiming for that, really being like, we'll screw over France so that the United States can still have its interest entrenched. And to a certain extent, I think Ruto and the political class here in Kenya thinks that that's a better way to go about it. But at the very least in the Sahel, they're like, no, out with the French and out with the Americans. So I think also when David talked about like the vassalage or that came with what's it called, the post 1940s arrangement, Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan. Yeah, with the Marshall Plan, it really was the European Union being vassalized to the United States. Think about how, for example, there are a number of ways that the United States could have better strengthened Europe to fight off the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? One of them could have been empowering the German economy, for example. But instead, he chose to be like, cut off your gas supply from Russia, depend on American oil, because the neoliberal worldview is never... Its strategy is more dependent on the military. Otherwise, economically speaking, it's always about the bottom dollar. That is always it for and I think that's part of the reason why the United States decline is almost guaranteed, not because of anything else, but because American power, how it operated and functioned, worked for a time. But nothing can work forever, especially when it comes to exploitation. Those systems rise and fall. And so I think even, for example, when you talk about the green energy race, you look at how America approaches it. Oil is still very profitable, very, very profitable. So the extent to which the private sector can engage in research and development for green energy, it's not as comparable to the government itself. That's why the private sector will just be like, let the government build it and then we'll just privatize it. That's not China's approach. China is very much like the government and the private sector under the whole arrangement of state capitalism, as how Deng Xiaoping formulated it, blah, blah, blah. It's very much at least blunting the whole thing for less about profits, let's actually move towards green energy. So I think in terms of the kind of push that the United States is going to have on green energy in Africa, I think it's more likely going to be just guaranteeing Africa is subdued militarily so that a lot of these foreign multinational companies that are American-backed from Europe to Israel, blah, 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 have a free range in being as inefficient as possible, doing a small amounts of green energy research while they continue to extract, as they're doing in the Niger Delta, for example. And we could talk about how polluted that is, but I think I've talked too much already.
No, that is excellent. I'm glad that you've given, you have enriched the points that David has made. But I will stay on the point because I want to hear from you. How are Africans organizing against this? Are Africans aware that this is happening?
I think, yes, not even aware. I think awareness isn't necessarily the problem. I think most, if not all, Africans are aware. I think the biggest problem is not knowing the problem. It's how to push back against the problem. I think Africans feel helpless.
No, let me reframe that question in the context of the Gen Z protests in Kenya that we're both very familiar with because we were both, embroiled in the situation. The Gen Zs went to the street talking about the finance bill, and they were able to make the connection between the finance bill and the IMF.
Yeah.
But it didn't seem clear to me that the connection between IMF and American hegemony was clearly being articulated, not in our media, not by our pundits, not by our public intellectuals. Who is articulating the case? Who is providing this analysis? And if this analysis is available, what sort of organizing is happening against this?
I love how you use the word organizing because it basically gives the solution and actually tells us the problem. See, people can organize around issues. That's not very difficult. The finance bill itself, again, it's a symptom of an underlying condition. So it's the issue, but it's not like the root cause of it all. And now when people rally around issues, that's just mobilization. Like that's easy, that can happen. For you to actually organize, it means you have to have a clear ideological path. That means you have to understand that you have to understand not just capitalism, but what it means to be anti-capitalist, right? So I think one of the things I've been trying to really repeat to people over and over again is that the fundamental basis of the political economy is that politics is directly on top of the foundation of the economy. So that means there is an ideological basis to which both of them run, right? So for example, our economy currently is in a capitalist mode, right? That means all of the politics that go into maintaining the capitalist ideology, economically speaking, will always be reflected in our policies, blah, blah, blah. But there is always a need to disguise the current. I'd be like, that thing of like, oh, I want to be neutral, blah, blah, blah. So like that kind of neutrality is what is often advocated for so that people like always respond to like the issues as opposed to becoming more political. I don't like when people say that, oh, why can't we approach an issue apolitically? Everything is political. Everything. And if everything is political, that means you need a political ideology. A lot of people who are on the streets during Maandamano had issues with the system, but you didn't see a lot of ideological kind of discussions happening around it. You see, the thing is, the state is built on the economy. Currently in Kenya, most of the local economy isn't enough to support the state. It isn't. It's very insufficient. And it's precisely because a lot of our economy is not geared towards the local economy, but the foreign economy. Foreign direct investments. When you talked about cotton, there's the whole thing about we have an export processing zone for clothes that are literally manufactured in Kenya, taken to the United States, slapped a label made in America, and then sold back. That is, you see how like the foreign economy is okay. So that means the local economies, the foreign economies don't support the Kenyan government, they support the American government. So the government at the end of the day has to take loans. That's actually the thing. It's not even that the government takes loans because it's corrupt. It's because the government cannot be supported by the stunted local economy. And while taking loans, it means then that, of course, Ruto is going to look at it and say, like, I want kickbacks. It doesn't matter if it's a Chinese loan or an IMF loan, but of course, the biggest problem is IMF. And so the kind of kickbacks, of course, are going to be different for China and based on the neoliberalism and state capitalism, all of that. But regardless, you see, when people are able to make that connection, there is often a need to like focus on, but we have a lot of debt. Well, how do we pay off this debt? So you see, there are always ways to keep like people on their toes, doubting themselves, be like, should we be on the streets? Maybe Ruto knows what he's doing. And that's all based on, we've responded to the issue. As long as Ruto has taken off Finance Bill 2024, that's fine. He took it off. He can implement it piecemeal. Nobody will notice. But that's the whole idea. Get people not to be political. The more Kenyans become political, the better the advancements away from just mobilization and towards organization.
Great. Thank you so much, Kiritu. So I know we're coming to the end of the show, but I want to come back to a point that David made before he leaves, where there's a fundamental difference between a Republican getting into the White House and the Democrats remaining in the White House, and that is in terms of reproductive rights. And we know that this doesn't just count for the American domestic policy, but it has a great impact on the sort of policies that are implemented in countries that are very dependent on American aid for their health programs, because Republicans will tend to extend their policies, their reproductive rights policies, towards this aid. Now, my question is not whether this is going to change between Kamala and Trump, because we can almost expect what is going to happen. But my question is that the American left is having its own internal struggle about the contradictions between between understanding that a democratic presidency will not fundamentally shift the country towards the just goals that the American left wishes to see, but understanding that the reproductive rights that could be stripped away by Republican presidency will have a great impact on the lives of those who are going to be affected. And so there are those who will make the bargain that I will advocate for, I will campaign for, and I will vote for a democratic presidency, because I think that those benefits that are going to accrue to those who are going to have access to reproductive rights are worth it at the end. Because if all else stays constant, at least let that be the marginal benefit that takes me towards the democratic presidency. Do you think that this is a bargain that we need to be thinking about striking as the left wing of Africa?
I would never dare to lecture or even lend guidance to the left on the continent that has to make its own decisions in the context of also extremely troubling and dire circumstances. It's certainly an issue that the U.S. American left is struggling with and has struggled with for a very long time because of the bipartisan nature of our electoral system that basically guarantees these two parties infinite dominance over any rivals. There's no good solutions, basically. And when you think about the diversity of the crisis in the United States, there's a helicopter just like haunting me in this hotel room. Anyway, maybe I'm talking too much about third-party options and they're targeting me.
Be careful.
I think that there's no solution to this problem. I mean, you have, and this is why I don't judge anybody for the decisions that they make in this election. I mean, you have a party that's supposed to be representative of key principles of not just individual freedoms, but collective liberation. I mean, this is sort of what the Democrats are offering rhetorically, and then of course are raining bombs and conducting a genocide in daylight. And so if people draw their red line there, then so be it. I mean, this is the lesser evilism that haunts the U.S. American political system. And I guess my only thought for people who are organizing in other country contexts and other political systems is to not take for granted the idea that there might be a political space that would transcend our bipartisan trap, and not to be hesitant about building their own party, because parties have been, remain today, and will continue to be the dominant organ through which the critical mode of organizing that we've been discussing is conducted. And so building strong and rebellious parties, I think, is the only solution. And many of my friends and allies here in the U.S. are trying this, and I think that they're making substantial strides. But it's just a monstrosity of an electoral system that basically doesn't permit dissent, let alone alternative victories. But on that note of utter pessimism, but I think it can be reiterated as a note of optimism for others who are working in the African context, where there is room to be linking up with movements for liberation and anti-colonial liberation in particular, not to take that for granted, to find those rays of hope where basically you have movements that are unapologetic about the desire to create a more sovereign, food sovereign, energy sovereign, security sovereign continent. Cling to those, learn from them, and hopefully through an organization like mine, through the Progressive International, find allies who can support, entrench those victories, and keep them resilient in the face of an increasingly bellicose United States. So I do have to leave. I want to thank you, Mamka, for having me on. This is an incredibly exciting project, and I'm feeling very honored to be part of its initial presentation, and I hope you have me back very soon in the future. Certainly, we're just days away from the U.S.-American election, so it's not the end of a discussion about the consequences as we barrel towards the inauguration in January of whatever new administration will take shape.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for being with us today. And Kiritu, thank you so much. I will give you a few seconds to give us a parting shot.
This is tricky. Land, food, and freedom, I guess.
Land, food, and freedom.
Land, food, and freedom. Let me see. Is there anything probably? I don't want to go into a rabbit hole or anything like that. I think maybe just piggybacking off of what David just said. Transcending the contradictions that currently exist. Maybe I'd probably add by saying, we need to and try as much as possible to build parallel institutions. I think the difference between reform and revolution is always based on, are you willing to just be like, this isn't going to serve my interests anymore, let's all gather together and try and build something else. I think, for example, people's assemblies, here in Kenya, people are doing them. That's literally the whole thing of the National Coordination Committee for People's Assemblies. When you build parallel institutions that are more like, we aren't necessarily going to have our try and make room within the existing spaces, because all of them are built towards serving the current status quo interest. So when we start doing that, then you are the contradictions are going to break. You're going to find at one point there is going to be a break somewhere. So we have to be ready to enlarge it, widen it so it can transcend and break through. Land, food, and freedom.
Great. Thank you so much, Kiritu, for joining us today. And to our viewers and listeners, stay tuned. Our next episode will be announced soon. And follow us on X, find us on YouTube, A Certain Amount of Madness.
And thank you so much for having me, Mamka. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure being here with you, with David, and having these conversations.